Let's continue our conversation and our discussion about how Paul takes charge. We said that true leadership is tested and proven only in crises. You can have all the intellectual conversations that you want. You can have all the yip-yap sessions that you want. But let me tell you something. Leadership has to lead. You lead in front. You lead with wisdom by trusting God. And do not be afraid to bow your knees and pray and let your people see that you're depending upon God and God alone. You better get a word from God. And that's what Paul had done. By now, he had, in effect, taken charge, and he's still at the bottom of the boat. He's yelling up at them. He didn't usurp anyone else's authority. All of them more or less capitulated to Paul because he was the only one with a clue as to what to do. Can you imagine that? And that is why, although Paul began his journey as the prisoner, the low man on the ship's organizational chart, he was the low man at the bottom of the toilet. He was literally at the bottom of the toilet. All on the board were now looking to Paul for leadership. Can you imagine? This is beyond comprehension. He's at the bottom of the ship down with the toilet looking up, and they're all up on top looking down, and they're looking at him for leadership. Hallelujah. Isn't that great? The captain wasn't leading. That was clear. The pilot was not leading. That was clear. The centurion was not leading. That was clear. The pilot was no longer even steering the ship. You remember? They had tied it down. The centurion didn't take over in the chaos. He was evidently as perplexed and confused and frightened, scared to death as everybody else was. The only guy left with any sense of composure was Paul, and he was a rock at the bottom of the ship. This underscores the truth that leadership is not something that is automatically conferred by any title or by any rank. It is earned in the crucible of the fire. Again, leadership is influence. Influence. You receive influence and you give influence. It's a matter of ability, not position. That's the reason why so many people have titles. Okay? They've got titles and they got the position, they have the position and they have the paycheck, but they couldn't lead themselves out of a wet paper bag. They couldn't lead people out of a wet paper bag. They're in this little circle and they're caught in this thing and they don't know how to get out of it. As we read Luke's account of this shipwreck, it's quite an amazing picture to see all of these powerful men accustomed to giving orders, outranking others, suddenly looking down to Paul, the prisoner, who had to earn the right to lead them. Now, it's dark, it's nearing midnight, and they're approaching the island of Malta. It's now dark. The ship continued to be driven by hurricane-force winds for days. This is 120-mile-hour winds plus 120, 130, 140, 160. These were gale-force winds. They were just blowing. The crew and the passengers' panic was stretched out with intensity for days. Can you imagine? These people don't know what to do. They're being pounded on for days in the middle of this storm. The struggle to stay afloat was so intense that nobody ate for 2 full weeks. Can you imagine that? They went on a fast and didn't know they were going on a fast. They were petrified with fear. They were terrified. They had not the faintest idea where they were. They had lost all of their bearings as they were in the midst of the storm. They didn't even know what direction they were going. They had no clue. The Apostle Paul's assurance that they would all survive was the last hope that they had to cling to. That was it. Now, we pick up Luke's account of the struggle list. Now, go to Acts chapter 27:27. Acts 27:27, and let's work out way down to verse 27, 28, and 29 just briefly here. But when the 14th night, you see, that's 2 weeks, came as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little farther on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. Now, I'm not a sailor, okay? You know, I was taught how to jump out of airplanes. Okay? That's what I was taught how to do, okay? I was not a sailor, okay? But I can tell you that you read the scriptures and you go, I have no clue what he's talking about here whatsoever. And, you know, and that's typical. People read it and they go, and so they just move on. They go, well, it's a nice story, cute story. That's nice, but I have no idea what he's talking about. And they've not comprehended the profundity of how this impacts on leadership. See, that's the reason why you and I, when we come to the pulpit, we have to take time to teach our people and give the background information, okay, so that they have a greater appreciation for what God has truly done here. So let me give you some background information about verse 27, 28, and 29. Now, they're in the Adriatic Sea, of course, and this is a narrow arm of the Mediterranean Sea that lies between Italy and the Balkan Peninsula, and you'll have to see a map for that, okay? And you have to understand that this is the part where it doesn't matter anywhere from Israel, from that coast all the way to Italy, it's just storm after storm after storm. This is dangerous sailing. But in this particular area, in the Adriatic Sea. So in Paul's day, however, the Ionian Sea, which is what it was called, it was this large open expanse between the bottom of what, you know how Italy is designed, they call it the Italian boot, okay? This is at the bottom of that, okay? And on the west side of the western Greece on the east, okay? So this is between the boot of Italy, which is down here, and Greece. Right in here, okay, is where we're talking about, right between those 2 points right there. And this is where, and that part was considered as part of the Adriatic Sea. This is where they were stuck, okay? Paul's ship was blown and tossed about in the vast region of the Mediterranean for 2 full weeks. I can't even fathom that, for two full weeks. That is a long time to be caught in such a desperate situation. They were so turned around, they had no clue where they were. They could not look up because, remember, there was no stars, there was no sun. The storm went on for 2 weeks. Then around midnight on the 14th night, they sensed land. Now, I just want you to keep in mind these verses 27, 28, and 29 as I explain them to you, okay? And we're still in verse 27. I'm just kind of breaking down verse 27 here for you, okay? So around midnight on the 14th night, they sensed land. In the dark of a cloudy night, it would be next to impossible to see any outline on the horizon. It was just next to impossible, right? And that's why Luke didn't say that they saw land. It doesn't say that. Rather, they surmised or they sensed it. Look at it. Look at it. In verse 27, but when the 14th night came in, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to what? To surmise, to sense that they were approaching some land. That's what it says. So they couldn't see it. This most likely means that they heard the faint sounds of waves crashing on the nearby shore. That's the reason why they can sense it. Right? So they took soundings, because that's what it says here in verse 28. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little farther on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Well, what does that mean? Well, the process involved lowering a rope with weights until it hit the bottom of the ocean, the bottom of the sea. And then they would measure the rope that would tell them the depth of the ocean, how far it was down. Now, the first measured, okay, or the first sounding, okay, measured the depth of 20 fathoms. So you go, what is a fathom? Well, a fathom is the length of 2 outstretched arms, okay, which is standardized to be exactly 6 feet long. That's what that's talking about, okay? So a fathom is the equivalent of 6 feet. So 1 fathom is 6 feet, 2 fathoms is 12 feet, 3 fathoms is 18 feet, 4 fathoms is 24 feet, and so forth and so forth and so forth. You understand that? So now, what they're saying here is that the first time that they measured it, it was 20 fathoms, okay? And that would be about 120 feet deep. So they began to get an idea of how close they were to shore. It was deep for safety, but shallow enough to indicate that they were longer out, that they were still out longer in deep sea. Okay? So at that moment, that brief moment, we're okay. We're not way out there, but now we're not too close near the rocks and don't know what we're going to hit. For the moment, we're okay. Then look at verse 28. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. You see that? So they waited a while and sounded again, and this time they found about 15 fathoms. That would be 90 feet. Now things are beginning to get dicey, okay? They were moving toward shore quickly, probably a lot quicker than they wanted to. That was the cause for panic, not an occasion for rejoicing, okay? Because look what it says in verse 29. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. So this is causing panic because now we go from 120 to 90 feet. That means they're moving toward shore a lot faster than they anticipated. And that is what's causing panic because it says in verse 29, fearing that we might run aground. This was not no time to be rejoicing and laughing and celebrating. This was a highly dangerous situation to be in at midnight because they cannot see anything. They were literally washing ashore and unable to see what lay ahead of them. In water that shallow, there are frequently submerged rocks offshore, jutting outcrops that sink ships without warning. It was a sailor's worst nightmare. They were sailing blind in the middle of the night, knowing that only that every wave took them closer and closer to danger because they could not see. So they put out 4 anchors and prayed for morning to come. And they just hope that this is where they can stay here. So they dumped 4 anchors out. Okay? So at the bow, at the stern, okay, on both sides, they dropped this thing down and to hold them in position, right? The majority of the storm has now subsided, okay, after 2 weeks. And now they hope that they're going to go to sleep. And by morning time, they're going to be able to see where they are exactly. But at least they're not jettisoning toward the shore to run aground. They didn't know it yet, of course, but the island they were nearing was the island of Malta. Look at Acts chapter 28. Okay? Acts chapter 28. Look what it says in verse 1. And when they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. Okay? So that's where they finally arrived at. Okay? And it's a small island. You know, it's not a really big island. You know, it's only like 17 miles long and 9 miles wide. So you can see it's a small island. It wasn't like Crete. You remember Crete was 35 miles wide and 170 miles long. Okay? Well, the island of Malta is only 17 miles long and 9 miles wide. So this wasn't very big, okay? Right? And it's about 60 to 70 miles south of Sicily. So they're venturing more toward Italy at this point. Now that'll tell you how far they got blown away from where they had no idea where they were, okay? So Malta is a small island directly south of Sicily. Now, the geographical features of the region are in exact accord with the ocean depths Luke recorded. Now, you go, well, how do you know that? Well, experts who have studied maritime Rome also corroborated all of the other details of Luke's account, because later on they went to find out. Okay? Now, what Luke wrote, was it true? And from all of the maritime research and records, we discovered that it is. How? Well, for example, the distance from the island of Clauda, you remember that? That's where the ship was last sighted. You remember that? You don't remember that. Go to Acts chapter 27, verse 16. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And that's when, quote unquote, all hell broke loose for them. Okay? So they're in Clauda 2 weeks earlier. And now look where they find themselves. Okay? They find themselves all the way where Malta is. Do you understand how far that was? That's 476.6 nautical miles. That's how far they were blown off. Well, put it this way. They were 2,376 kilometers blown off course. That's how far they went. Okay. Let's assume the ship was drifting at the rate of 36 miles every 24 hours. Now, all of the nautical experts say that this is about what we would expect with a Roman-style cargo ship in those currents at that time of the year in the gale force wind. Now, how did they know that? Because they've now accumulated enough data with ships now. Now they can calculate what happens when the ship is in a distress. Drifting at that rate, it would take them up exactly 13 days, 1 hour and 21 minutes to be driven from Clauda to Malta. Isn't that amazing? That's just, I don't know about you, but I'm just amazed with that. 13 days, 1 hour and 21 minutes. Now, the scripture tells us it's roughly 14 days. Isn't that amazing? You add a day from Fairhavens to Clauda, and that's precisely 2 weeks. So it is, in fact, a 14-day journey from Fairhavens to Malta if you happen to make it in a drifting ship being blown by a hurricane. I mean, that's not the way I would necessarily recommend you traveling at all. Now, judging from the data that Luke gives about the depth of the water, they were less than 3 miles from the island. That's pretty dangerous for a ship that size. They could have been near the mouth of a large bay on the northwest side of the island. In modern times, the bay is known as St. Paul's Bay, though it may not have been the actual place where Paul came ashore. There is another bay at the eastern extremity of the island of Malta known as St. Thomas Bay that some say fits the description more accurately. So I just don't want to get into an argument about, are you sure, okay? So about the time they sounded for the depth, right? Remember, they went to measure down, okay? They would have been drifting about a half a mile offshore from the eastern end of the island. Again, that was not good news. This is how they could hear the pounding surf. Follow me? Notice Luke said that they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, which of course is the back end of the boat. Okay? That would automatically make the prow of the ship point inland. So in other words, if the stern is in the back, the prow's in the front, so it would point, and when they drop these things, okay, right, from both sides in the back, okay, and directly in the back, and now pushes this boat, and it points toward the island, okay? And so, and we see that, right? That would automatically make the brow of the ship point inland, and the plan, evidently, was that when daybreak came, they could see the shore. Now, how did they know that? Because of the hearing of the shores, the waves pounding the shore, they can anticipate it's in that direction. Okay? Okay? So when daybreak came, they could see the shore if it looked safe. They would raise the 4 anchors, drift straight in, and beach the ship. Okay? And they would just let the waves carry them in, and they would hit the beach. That's what the plan was. The winds were apparently still too powerful to risk sailing until they could find a safe harbor. There were still winds, strong winds out there. I want you to understand that. Now, we've taken the time to describe this because you need to understand the conditions, okay, by which Paul takes over his leadership. Everybody's already capitulated to him, and now he's going to rise to the occasion. And this is the interesting part. Now he's barking out orders. He's giving orders. But he's not just being a brute about this. Look at the wisdom that he uses. He begins to speak to existing authority, and the existing authority barks out the order. But everybody can see that. But he never, ever violated, quote unquote, the chain of command. So here's what's going to happen. In fact, the weather conditions were still so bad that some of the sailors, you know what they tried to do? They tried to secretly abandon the ship in the middle of the night, pretending to work on more anchors at the prow end of the ship, which would be at the front end, okay? Some of them had dropped the dinghy. Remember the little skiff, the little boat that they had brought up? Remember that in the middle of the storm? And they were planning to use it to slip away from the damaged ship. So they were going to abandon their captain. They were going to abandon the pilot. They're going to abandon the centurion soldiers. They're going to abandon 276 passengers. That was the plan. I want you to understand. That's what they were planning to do. And it isn't unusual for passengers to get nervous about adverse weather. Let me tell you something. I've been on a ship, and I remember experiencing that. But if you've ever been on a ship and the crew panics, now you know everybody's in trouble. Okay? Everybody's in trouble. You better know how to swim, okay? Because you're about to go see Jesus with the little fishes. That's what's about to happen, okay? You're out in the middle, okay, of the ocean. You have no clue exactly as to where you are. And that's exactly what happened here. Now, let's pick up the story, and let's look at Luke's description back in chapter 27, and let's look at verse 30 and 31. It says this. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, that's the little dinghy, the skiff, under pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. You see that? Paul can see, can perceive. He could not be deceived, okay? And worship, you see, the sailors had a habit of talking among themselves, okay? The prisoners were not allowed to talk, but now for the very first time, a prisoner is opening his mouth. He's talking. That's Paul. And people listening to him. So he could see what's happening, okay? He can clear. Why would you be doing this in the middle of the night? That didn't even make sense. 1 + 1 was not 2. 1 + 1 was 11 here. He could figure out that everything here was not adding up whatsoever. And now the irony is that Paul is going to put a stop to the escape. That was the irony of everything that takes place here. And now this is where his leadership turns the corner.